When the elderly elephant Tembo collapsed to his knees, the male lion Bakari was watching from 50 meters away, and what unfolded over the next 5 days would challenge everything that wildlife scientists believed about the emotional capacity of predators and the boundaries that separated species in the natural world. Tembo was 60 years old and dying slowly from the accumulated effects of age, his teeth worn down to useless nubs that made eating impossible, his body consuming itself as starvation progressed through stages that rangers had been documenting for months, with a sad awareness that intervention was not possible in wild populations where natural death was part of the ecosystem's functioning. Everyone who observed Tembo during those final months had noticed his decline. The rangers who tracked elephant movements, the other elephants in his bachelor herd who had gradually drifted away as Tembo became too weak to keep pace with their travels, and Bakari, the 9-year-old male lion who had been Tembo's neighbor for 8 years in this section of Kruger National Park. For 8 years, Bakari and Tembo had shared the same water sources and resting spots, maintaining a relationship that rangers had documented as unprecedented in the scientific literature on lion-elephant interactions. Normally, these species avoided each other or engaged in antagonistic encounters where elephants would chase lions away from kills or water, and lions would occasionally hunt young or sick elephants when opportunities arose. But Bakari and Tembo had never fought, never threatened, never displayed the typical hostility that characterized interactions between Africa's largest land animal and its apex predator. The mutual respect between them seemed to arise from simple mathematics. Tembo was too large for Bakari to threaten. Bakari was too small to pose danger to a healthy adult elephant. And over years of repeated peaceful encounters at shared resources, something resembling friendship had developed between two beings who by all evolutionary logic should have maintained species boundaries that prevented such bonds. Now Tembo was on the ground, unable to rise, and Bakari approached with careful steps that communicated awareness that something significant was happening to the elephant who had been a constant presence in his territory for nearly his entire adult life. Under normal circumstances, lions would view a dying or injured large animal as a feeding opportunity, easy prey that required minimal effort or risk to hunt. But Bakari did not stalk or attack. He sat down approximately 3 meters from where Tembo lay struggling to breathe, and he waited, because this elephant was not just meat. This was Tembo, his companion of 8 years. And Bakari was not going to leave him alone in death any more than he had left him alone in life during all those shared afternoons resting in the same shade while the African sun turned the savannah into a furnace that only fools and desperate creatures moved through. Before we continue this profound journey into animal grief and cross-species bonds that transcend the predator-prey relationship, if stories about the emotional depth of wild animals and their capacity for relationships that mirror human friendship touch your heart, consider subscribing to Lion King Stories. Every subscription helps us share more of these remarkable true tales that prove animals experience grief and loss in ways that science is only beginning to understand, and that the categories we use to separate species into predators and prey miss the deeper truth that individuals can form bonds that make such labels irrelevant when death demands witness and mourning. Your support helps spread the message that animals are not biological machines following instinctive scripts, but conscious beings capable of love and loss and loyalty that persists beyond the final breath. The 8-year friendship between Bakari and Tembo had begun in 2011, when Bakari was barely more than a cub at 18 months old, recently separated from his mother, and beginning the dangerous transition to independent survival that killed more than half of all young male lions before they reached maturity. Tembo had been 52 years old at that time, already an elderly elephant by wild standards, but still strong and experienced, carrying the wisdom that came from surviving decades in an environment where drought, disease, poachers, and territorial conflicts created constant threats to existence. Their first encounter at the waterhole that would become their shared meeting place had followed the typical script for lion-elephant interactions. Tembo had been drinking when Bakari approached cautiously from downwind, and the elephant had responded with threat displays that included spreading his ears and swinging his trunk in warning motions that communicated clear boundaries about appropriate distance. Bakari had retreated that first day, waiting until Tembo finished drinking and moved away before approaching the water himself, learning the lesson that young lions must learn about respecting animals larger and more dangerous than themselves. But over the following weeks and months, Repeated encounters at the same waterhole created familiarity that gradually replaced suspicion, and rangers began noting in their field observations that Bakari and Tembo were tolerating each other's presence at closer distances than typical lion-elephant interactions would suggest was comfortable for either party. By 6 months after their first meeting, they were resting in the same shade grove separated by 20 meters. But ecology textbooks were written by humans who observed populations and species rather than individuals, and what happened between Bakari and Tembo happened at the level of individual personality and experience rather than species-level behavior patterns. They simply liked each other's company in whatever way lions and elephants could experience such preferences, finding something in their regular encounters that made the space they shared more comfortable or interesting or safe than it would have been alone. The transformation from mutual tolerance to genuine attachment became visible to observers during the dry season of 2015, when a severe drought killed many animals and forced survivors into desperate competition for dwindling water sources. Tembo had been resting at the waterhole when a bachelor herd of younger elephants arrived and attempted to displace him through aggressive displays and physical intimidation, typical behavior for young males testing their strength and establishing dominance hierarchies. Bakari, who had been resting in shade 50 meters away, responded to the confrontation by approaching the waterhole and positioning himself between Tembo and the aggressive young elephants, not attacking but making his presence known in ways that complicated the young elephant's calculations about whether bullying the elderly Tembo was worth the potential cost of dealing with a lion who seemed invested in the outcome of their encounter. The young elephants withdrew, probably more confused than actually intimidated by Bakari's involvement, and Tembo remained at the waterhole while Bakari returned to his resting spot, the entire interaction lasting less than 5 minutes, but demonstrating that something more than casual acquaintance existed between the lion and the elephant. Rangers who witnessed this incident noted that Bakari had gained no obvious advantage from intervening in elephant social dynamics, had taken real risk by approaching a group of potentially dangerous young bulls, and had acted in ways that suggested he was defending Tembo rather than defending territory or resources. This was the moment when most observers stopped thinking of Bakari and Tembo as simply two animals who tolerated sharing space, and began considering that what they were witnessing might constitute actual interspecies friendship in the full meaning of that term. Now, in October 2019, that 8-year friendship was ending as Tembo's body finally surrendered to age and starvation. Ranger Peter Kumalo was the first to observe that Bakari had taken up position near the dying elephant, and was not leaving despite opportunities to hunt or drink or engage in any of the normal activities that constituted a lion's daily existence. Peter radioed to the research station, "This is Peter at grid 12. Tembo is down and looks terminal. Bakari is here and sitting vigil. Request additional observers because I think we're witnessing something significant. Over." Dr. Seram Thembu, a wildlife behaviorist who had been studying lion cognition and social bonds for 15 years, responded to Peter's call and arrived at the site within 90 minutes, bringing camera equipment and recording devices that would document what became one of the most remarkable examples of cross-species grief ever captured in scientific observation. The first night of Bakari's vigil was marked by vocalizations that Peter and Dr. Thembu both described as unlike any lion sounds they had encountered in decades of field work. Lions have an extensive vocal repertoire that includes roars used for territorial advertisement and long-distance communication, grunts and moans used for close-range social interaction within prides, and aggressive snarls and growls used during conflicts and hunting. But the sounds Bakari made throughout that first night fit none of these established categories. They were low-frequency calls that had a trembling quality suggesting distress or pain, sustained for longer durations than typical contact calls, and directed specifically at Tembo's position rather than broadcast generally into the environment the way territorial roars were projected. Dr. Thembu recorded over 3 hours of these vocalizations and later analyzed them using spectrographic equipment that revealed acoustic properties that did not match any sounds in the extensive database of lion communication that researchers had compiled over decades of study. The frequency modulation patterns and temporal structure of Bakari's calls more closely resembled the distress vocalizations that social mammals produced when separated from attachment figures or when experiencing grief responses to the death of companions. When Dr. Tembo presented these recordings at a wildlife behavior conference 6 months later, the response from colleagues was skepticism that lions were capable of the kind of grief that these vocalizations seemed to represent. But no one could offer alternative explanations that accounted for why Bakari would produce such sounds in the context of sitting beside a dying elephant for hours without attempting to feed or leave. The second day brought new evidence of the depth of Bakari's commitment to remaining with Tembo through the dying process. A clan of 8 spotted hyenas detected the scent of dying elephant and approached the area with clear intention to claim what would be an enormous food source once Tembo died. Hyenas were aggressive scavengers and opportunistic predators who could kill even healthy large animals when attacking in groups, and they had no hesitation about driving single lions away from carcasses through numerical superiority and coordinated harassment. Under normal circumstances, a lone male lion would retreat when faced with 8 hyenas rather than risk serious injury, defending a food source that he couldn't eat fast enough to make fighting worthwhile. But Bakari did not retreat. He charged the approaching hyenas with such aggressive intensity that the entire clan scattered in genuine alarm, apparently recognizing that this lion was willing to fight to the death to protect something that none of them understood. The functional interpretation of Bakari's defense would be that he was guarding a future food source from competitors, but this explanation failed to account for why he wasn't feeding on Tembo while the elephant was still dying, or why he continued to guard the body for 2 days after death when decomposition had proceeded to the point where the meat was no longer appealing or safe for consumption. Dr. Tembo's interpretation, which she argued in her published case study, was that Bakari was not defending food but was instead engaging in protective behavior that more closely resembled funeral rites than resource guarding, and that his aggression towards scavengers represented an unwillingness to allow Tembo's body to be desecrated rather than any concern about losing access to nutrients. Tembo died on the evening of the 3rd day, approximately 72 hours after Bakari had first taken up position beside him. The death was quiet and unremarkable as deaths go, simply a gradual cessation of breathing that transitioned Tembo from a dying elephant to a dead elephant without drama or final moments of struggle. Bakari had been lying within 2 meters of Tembo's head during those final hours, close enough that he could feel the elephant's weakening breaths and watch the gradual dimming of awareness that preceded the final shutdown of biological systems. When Tembo stopped breathing, Bakari stood and approached to within touching distance, extending one paw to make gentle contact with Tembo's trunk in a gesture that observers interpreted as a final check for life or perhaps a deliberate act of farewell. What followed over the next 48 hours was behavioral repertoire that had no clear parallel in the scientific literature on lion behavior. Bakari did not feed on Tembo's body despite not having eaten in over 3 days. He did not leave to hunt other prey or to drink water at the nearby hole where he and Tembo had shared so many afternoons. He maintained his position within 5 meters of the body, occasionally approaching to touch Tembo's trunk or ear or tusks with his paw, and he continued to make those strange trembling vocalizations that Dr. Tembo had recorded during the dying process. Rangers maintained observation posts throughout this period, documenting Bakari's behavior with still cameras and video equipment that would provide evidence supporting conclusions that many in the scientific community would find difficult to accept. The most remarkable aspect of Bakari's post-death vigil was his continued defense of Tembo's body against scavengers despite the obvious deterioration and the complete absence of any material benefit from such protection. Vultures circled and landed in trees surrounding the clearing where Tembo lay, waiting for their opportunity to feed on the massive carcass that represented weeks of food for the local vulture population. But whenever vultures attempted to approach the body, Bakari would charge with aggressive displays that drove them back into the trees, creating a protected zone around Tembo that remained inviolate despite the bird's persistent attempts to access the feast that decomposition was creating. The detailed chronology of Bakari's 5-day vigil revealed patterns that became increasingly difficult to explain through simple behavioral mechanisms, and that strongly suggested conscious grief processing rather than instinctive responses to environmental stimuli. Day 1 had been characterized primarily by attentive watching as Tembo's breathing became increasingly labored and irregular, with Bakari maintaining position within 5 meters, and occasionally standing to reposition himself when Tembo shifted or made sounds that might have indicated distress. Rangers noted that Bakary's body language during this first day showed signs of agitation, including frequent tail movements and changes in ear position that suggested he was tracking Tembo's condition with active concern rather than passive observation. Day 2 brought the first aggressive interactions with scavengers and the beginning of the unusual vocalizations that would continue throughout the remainder of the vigil. The battle with the hyena clan occurred in mid-afternoon, when Tembo was clearly entering the final stages of dying, and the scent of impending death had begun attracting carnivores and scavengers from kilometers away. After driving off the hyenas, Bakari returned to his position near Tembo and began making those trembling low-frequency calls that Dr. Tembo would later identify as acoustically distinct from all known lion vocalizations. These calls occurred in bouts lasting 5 to 15 minutes with gaps of silence between bouts, and they were always directed toward Tembo rather than broadcast generally, suggesting communicative intent even though Tembo showed no responses that indicated awareness of Bakary's vocalizations. Day 3 was the day of Tembo's death, and rangers noted subtle changes in Bakary's behavior during the hours leading up to that final moment. He moved closer to Tembo than he had positioned himself on previous days, eventually lying down within 1 meter of the elephant's head, where he could feel each labored breath and watch the gradual slowing of respiratory movements that preceded death. When Tembo's breathing stopped, Bakari remained motionless for several minutes, as if waiting to confirm that this cessation was permanent, rather than a temporary pause in the irregular breathing pattern that had characterized the final hours. Only after this waiting period did Bakari stand and make that gentle paw contact with Tembo's trunk that observers interpreted as either a check for signs of life or a deliberate gesture of farewell. But once Tembo died, Bakari's behavior changed to something that more closely resembled memorial ritual or funerary practice, with less active monitoring and more stationary positioning near the body combined with those regular returns to touch Tembo's trunk or tusks in gestures that served no obvious functional purpose, but that felt to human observers like acts of remembrance or continued connection with a companion who no longer existed as a living being. Day 4 was characterized primarily by defense against vultures who had been circling since Tembo's death, and who were becoming increasingly bold in their attempts to access the body as their hunger overcame their fear of the lion who guarded it. Bakari charged approaching vultures at least 30 times during Day 4 according to range accounts, running at the birds with aggressive intensity even though he was by this point severely weakened by 4 days without food or water and by the stress of constant vigilance. The energy expenditure required for these repeated charges was substantial and served no survival purpose that evolutionary theory would predict, because once Bakari left or died himself, the vultures would consume Tembo's body regardless of how vigorously he defended it in the present moment. This irrational defense made sense only if understood as grief-driven behavior, where Bakari was protecting something he valued symbolically rather than materially. Day 5 brought the departure that rangers had been wondering if they would ever witness, because Bakari's commitment to remaining with Tembo had been so absolute that it seemed possible he might literally remain until he died of starvation rather than voluntarily abandon his vigil. The morning of Day 5 was different from previous mornings in ways that rangers noted even before Bakari made any moves toward leaving. He was more restless, standing and lying down repeatedly, pacing short distances and then returning to Tembo's body, as if working through internal conflict between the pull to stay and the necessity of leaving to survive. This restless period lasted approximately 2 hours before Bakari finally approached Tembo's head for what would be his final contact. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Bakari finally made the decision to leave. Rangers watched as he approached Tembo's head one final time and placed his paw on the elephant's trunk in a gesture that precisely mirrored the contact he had made immediately after death, as if completing a ritual that had begun with farewell and ended with release. Then Bakari turned away from the body and began walking toward the waterhole, moving slowly at first but accelerating to a run after covering about 50 meters, as if he had to escape quickly before his resolve to leave could weaken and bring him back to maintain a vigil that could not continue indefinitely. Dr. Tembo and the ranger team continued monitoring both Bakari's movements and the fate of Tembo's body over the following weeks. The pattern that emerged provided final evidence that what they had witnessed was grief rather than resource guarding or any other functional behavior that evolutionary theory might predict. Bakari never returned to feed on Tembo's carcass, despite the fact that it remained in its territory, and despite the extreme hunger he must have experienced after 5 days without food. More remarkably, for 3 weeks following Tembo's death, Bakari returned daily to the area where the body lay decomposing, positioning himself approximately 100 meters away and remaining there for periods ranging from 30 minutes to several hours. Simply watching the location where his friend had died and been left to the vultures and hyenas, and the natural processes of decomposition that returned biological matter to the ecosystem. These daily returns created a pattern that rangers began anticipating and documenting with increasing care as they recognized that they were witnessing behavior that had no precedent in the lion research literature. Bakari would typically arrive in the late afternoon, the same time of day when he and Tembo had often shared shade during their 8 years of friendship, suggesting that his returns were triggered by temporal cues associated with their routine interactions rather than by any expectation of finding Tembo alive or any practical purpose related to resources. He would position himself at the same spot each day, a slight rise approximately 100 meters from where Tembo's body lay being consumed by scavengers, and he would lie down facing the death site and remain motionless except for occasional head movements that tracked vulture and hyena activity around the carcass. The most emotionally affecting aspect of these memorial visits was that Bakari would sometimes make those same unusual vocalizations that he had produced during the vigil, the trembling low-frequency calls that Dr. Tembo had recorded and analyzed and determined were acoustically distinct from functional lion communication. The calls during these return visits were less frequent than during the vigil itself, usually only 1 or 2 vocalizations per visit, rather than the sustained bouts that had characterized days 2 through 5, but their presence suggested that whatever emotional or psychological state Bakari had been experiencing during Tembo's dying and death was being reactivated during these memorial returns to the site where those traumatic events had occurred. Rangers reported that watching Bakari during these visits was emotionally difficult even for professionals who were trained to maintain objective distance from the subjects they studied. There was something profoundly sad about seeing a powerful predator sitting alone on a hillside making sounds of grief toward a location where his friend's body was being torn apart by scavengers, something that challenged the comfortable assumption that animals lived entirely in the present moment without the capacity to remember or mourn or feel the kind of prolonged sadness that humans experienced after loss. Peter Cumolo, who had worked with lions for 30 years, stated in an interview for a wildlife documentary, "I've seen lions do extraordinary things, hunt cooperatively, defend cubs against impossible odds, fight to the death protecting territory. But I've never seen anything that looked more human than Bakari sitting on that hill calling out to an elephant who couldn't hear him anymore. That was grief. Pure and simple." The memorial visits continued for 21 days before finally stopping, and the end point was as abrupt as their consistency had been remarkable. On day 22 after Tembo's death, Bakari did not return to the site, nor on day 23 or any day thereafter. Rangers who had been documenting the pattern initially wondered if something had happened to Bakari, but tracking confirmed that he was alive and had simply stopped making the daily pilgrimages to Tembo's death site. The carcass was by this point completely consumed, nothing remaining but bones and the largest pieces of hide that even hyenas could not efficiently process, and it was possible that the absence of any recognizable remains of Tembo had released Bakari from whatever compulsion had been driving his returns. Dr. Tembo's interpretation was that 21 days might represent some kind of natural endpoint for acute grief processing in lions, though she acknowledged that this was speculation based on a single case, and that much more research would be needed to understand whether lions had characteristic time courses for grief responses the way some other social mammals did. What was clear was that Bakari had not simply forgotten about Tembo or been distracted by new concerns, but rather had engaged in what appeared to be a deliberate process of repeated return and remembrance that eventually reached completion and allowed him to move forward with life in Tembo's absence. The scientific papers that Dr. Tembo published about Bakari and Tembo sparked intense debate in the wildlife behavior community about the appropriate interpretation of the observations and the extent to which attributing grief or mourning to a lion was anthropomorphism rather than legitimate scientific inference. Critics argued that Bakari's behavior could be explained through simpler mechanisms that did not require assuming complex emotions or self-aware processing of loss, suggesting that stress responses to environmental change or disrupted routine might account for the vocalizations and the reluctance to leave a familiar location where Bakari and Tembo had spent so much time together. But Dr. Tembo countered these criticisms by pointing to the totality of the behavioral evidence and asking critics to provide alternative explanations that accounted for all the documented patterns rather than cherry-picking individual elements that might fit simpler interpretations. He became more solitary and withdrawn, spending less time at the waterhole where he and Tembo had regularly met and avoiding the shade grove where they had rested together during hot afternoons. His hunting success declined measurably, suggesting that the motivation or focus required for effective predation had been compromised by psychological distress. He lost significant body weight and showed physical signs of stress, including poor coat condition and reduced activity levels that persisted for nearly 4 months before gradually returning to normal baseline functioning. These long-term behavioral and physiological changes matched patterns that researchers had documented in other social mammals who experienced loss of close companions, including primates, elephants, and cetaceans. The fact that Bakari showed grief responses that were consistent across species strongly suggested that whatever emotional experience he was having during and after Tembo's death was functionally similar to grief in humans and other animals, regardless of whether the subjective experience was identical or whether Bakari possessed self-aware understanding of death as an irreversible state. Perhaps the most profound question raised by Bakari and Tembo's story was not whether lions could experience grief. The evidence suggested they could, but rather what it meant that such grief could be directed toward an individual of a completely different species with whom Bakari shared no genetic relationship and no obvious survival advantage from maintaining a bond. This kind of cross-species attachment challenged fundamental assumptions about how evolution shaped emotional systems and social behaviors, because the textbook explanation for why animals formed social bonds emphasized genetic relatedness and reciprocal benefits that enhanced survival and reproduction. But Bakari gained no survival advantage from his friendship with Tembo, no increased hunting success or protection from rivals or access to resources that he could not have obtained alone. And Tembo had been too old to reproduce, eliminating any possibility that the relationship served some indirect genetic benefit through kinship or alliance. What existed between them appeared to be genuine friendship in the sense that philosophers and psychologists use that term when discussing human relationships. A voluntary association based on positive regard and shared experience that persisted because both individuals valued the connection itself rather than any material benefits it provided. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about the emotional capacity of predators and made you consider that grief might be a universal experience that transcends species boundaries when individuals form genuine bonds of friendship, we would be honored if you would share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us, how old are you? And where in the world are you watching this story from? We love knowing that these tales of animal consciousness and emotional depth reach people of all ages across every continent, and your comments help us understand our community and remind us that the capacity for empathy and wonder about the natural world is something humans share regardless of where we live or what language we speak. Have you ever witnessed an animal displaying grief or mourning in ways that suggested they understood loss and felt something resembling the sadness that humans experience when companions die? Your stories matter because they contribute to a growing body of evidence that animals are not fundamentally different from us in their capacity to love and lose and remember those they cared about. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more incredible true tales that prove nature is filled with mystery and meaning that science is only beginning to understand, that the boundaries between species are more permeable than we assume when individuals choose connection over category, and that sometimes the most profound truths about consciousness and emotion come not from laboratories, but from witnessing a lion refuse to leave a dying elephant's side because friendship demands presence in death as much as it demanded presence in life. Thank you for being part of our pride.